All right, so we are looking at the French emancipation movement in the Caribbean. And as opposed to the British Caribbean emancipation movement, we recognize that for the French, only one individual was the chief mastermind behind the movement or the campaign for emancipation. Right? The British had several: Thomas Clarkson, Granville Sharp, Thomas Buxton, quite a number of individuals working tirelessly behind the scenes and as public figures. But for the French, we only have Victor Schiller, born in Paris on July 12, 1804. By this time, of course, Wilberforce, Buxton, and Clarkson would have been well into working out the salvation of the slaves in the British Caribbean. Now, this individual, Victor Schiller, he worked tirelessly. He was a one-man band, basically, right? Now, if we look at how effective he was in the French territories, and in terms of also in France, we realize that his effectiveness was not as significant as was that of the work being done in the British emancipation movement, because he was by himself, he was a loner, right? He did not command the parliamentary support that the British had, right? Also, there was only one anti-slavery organization in France, only one, while we recognize that the British had multiple individuals and organizations working over a period of time to get the slaves their liberation. The French public was not aware of slavery as their counterpart in Britain, and so did not provide the same level of support. Because, of course, because of how the slaves were treated in the French Caribbean, it would appear as though it was not necessarily slavery in the eyes of the French citizens, because, of course, France is some 3,000 miles away from the Caribbean area. So the French citizens were not as exposed to the conditions of the slaves as the British would have been, the British citizens would have been in England. And we realize also that the citizens in the French territories and also in France itself, they were already focused on their own power struggle, internal struggle with the British monarch, getting rid of the king and the queen, and then moving into a phase where Napoleon Bonaparte was in charge of France, and also faced with their own revolution, the Haitian Revolution. So Victor Schiller was pretty much on his own in terms of trying to move into a period where he was now trying to remind the French of what took place in Haiti and making them aware of the conditions that slaves still had to encounter on a day-to-day basis in the territories such as Martinique, Guadeloupe, Saba, right? But there was not a lot of support. from, so he was born in 1804, right? And we know that in 1804, Haiti actually gained their independence from France. So he was born in that post-era period after the Haitian Revolution. Now, as it relates to Saint Dominic, we realize that the slaves in the French colonies were the first in the New Worlds to have been emancipated following the outbreak of the revolt in 1791, right? So the revolutionary commander, Sonthonax, who arrived in Saint Dominic in 1792, believing that order would return to the colony only if his forces had the full support of the slaves. What did he do? He emancipated the slaves. Subsequently, freedom was granted to the slaves in other French colonies. However, after Napoleon Bonaparte came to power, he restored slavery in all of the French territories. So we realize that emancipation, well, temporary emancipation, had actually come to the French territories before the British territories in 1792. However, we realize that under Napoleon Bonaparte, slavery was restored. Now we have a period now where the French, they are going to be implementing a period known to us as amelioration, right? So similar to what the British did, the French also had an amelioration period. However, the French actually had their emancipation, had their amelioration before the British. So we realize that 1792 emancipation, but then when Napoleon came to power, he restored slavery. Then now in 1815, at the Treaty of Vienna, France agreed to bring the slave trade to an end. So in 1815, at the Treaty of Vienna, France agreed to bring the slave trade to an end, right? And then later on, in the 1830s, the French government, responding to the numerous slave revolts in the colonies, they decided to introduce amelioration measures to improve the conditions of the slaves as the British had done previously. So what I would have said previously was actually incorrect. So the British were the ones who basically led the way to emancipation. And whatever the British did, it would seem as though the French actually copied what the British did. Seeing that the one-man band in France, Victor Schuller, he basically copied or followed what was happening in Britain in terms of copying what Granville Sharp, what Thomas Buxton, and the other abolitionists were doing, right? So 1815, abolition of the slave trade for the French territories. Then in the 1830s, we realized that amelioration proposals were put in place, right? Some of these measures, as listed by Doris Hamilton Willie in her book, Movements Towards Emancipation, lest you forget. One, the tax on manumission was abolished and manumission process simplified. So manumission, of course, mean the whole idea that you can purchase your freedom, right? Two, registration of all slaves was made compulsory. And we see that the British would have done their registration in 1816. And we see that the French doing the same thing now as a part of their amelioration proposals. Corporal punishment was limited. Branding and mutilation was prohibited. So you couldn't burn the slave with any hot iron, making any markings on the slave, that was prohibited. And cutting off body parts was also out of the question. Elementary education and religious instruction for slaves became mandatory, right? So we see that based on what happened in the British territories, it was similar in terms of the amelioration proposals. Now, Doris Hamilton makes this important point. She says that unlike in the self-governing British Caribbean islands, the government officials in the French Caribbean were required to adopt the amelioration measures. So, amelioration for the French actually worked better than it did for the British, because the British planters were not forced, they were not compelled to actually implement amelioration. Instead, it was free for all, basically. Do it if you want, do it if you don't want to do it, don't do it. If you feel like do it. But for the French now, because of course we realize that the French laws were actually drawn up by the metropolis. So the Code Noir, as we would have mentioned, was drawn up by the metropolis. These laws, these proposals, rather, the amelioration proposals, were also now drawn up by the government. And whatever the government say, then you know that you have to do it, right? Different kind of system. Now, public opinion was not satisfied with these measures, and so complete emancipation was demanded. Because of course, you know, the French, they are very we would say they are sympathizers, right? So based on the laws that were implemented, we realize that the laws were very favorable because they considered the slaves as persons first and property after. And for the British, we realized that they were simply considered as slaves. So the French, in terms of the treatment of slaves and their understanding and care and love for the black population, was better than that which we see in the British Caribbean. So complete emancipation was demanded. However, this demand was not fully met until 1848, almost a half a century after Napoleon Bonaparte had restored slavery in the French Caribbean. So let's look at the dates for the French emancipation movement. So we see that Victor Schuyler, he was the one who was working tirelessly, working, handing out pamphlets, trying to get laws passed, right? He would have been convicted of his wanting the slaves to be emancipated when he would have visited the Caribbean, the French islands, in 1829, right, where he recognized the abuse of slavery, and he was so deeply wounded that when he returned to France, he started the fight for abolition, right? And then now in 1834, he came up with his abolition campaign and formed his organization for the emancipation of the slaves in the French Caribbean. All right. In 1815, though, we realized that the French, they abolished slavery, the slave trade rather. So they abolished the slave trade, and then in the 1830s they came up with abolition, and then in 1848 we realized that they're they simply just gave emancipation to everybody. Notice that when we compare the French and the British, we realize that the French, they did not have a period of apprenticeship. So there was no period of apprenticeship in the French islands, right? So the British islands had that, right? So the French and the British, that's the main takeaway, that the French did not have a period of apprenticeship. Pretty simple and straightforward. So Victor was the one who was orchestrating everything. So it was a one-man band trying to get rid of the slaves, trying to get rid of slavery in the French Caribbean. And pretty much never take him a lot of time, because by 1829, when he had become vested in getting rid of slavery, by 1848, it was done. So it didn't take him a lot of time. But when we look at the British now, we realize that from just before 1870, we see where the movement kick-started, and it ended all the way in 1838. So we realize that the British would have laid the foundation, and the French would have come in and used some of the strategies that the British used. We see that definitely in the French emancipation movement. When we now turn our attention to the Spanish emancipation, we realize that it was not as the British and the French. What were the reasons abolition came later in the Spanish colonies? So we realize that the British led the way in 1838 with abolition of slavery, and then the French in 1848. But we realize that for the Spanish, it came much, much later. Let's see why. One, in 1817, the Spanish government signed a treaty with Great Britain where it pledged itself to abolish the slave trade in 1820. Right? But of course, the trade continued in spite of the subsequent treaties. So they continued with this slave trade nonetheless, even though they entered into an agreement, right? There was a tremendous increase in the production of sugar in Cuba. And we'll realize later on when we go to theme 6 that Cuba basically became the leading producers of sugar because the British sugar had declined because of abolition, because of emancipation, because of the end of slavery. The existence of slavery in the United States of America until 1860s and Brazil until 1888 helped to prolong the slave trade under the cover of the United States flag. flown by traders who supplied those countries with slaves. So we realize that the Spanish territories continued to receive slaves. So of course we realize that United States is tied to Puerto Rico in some ways. We realize that the trade continued to flourish because the United States pumped funding into Cuba and also into Puerto Rico, those two main Spanish territories. There was no strong support for abolition from the Roman Catholic Church. So the Roman Catholic Church in Cuba was not necessarily saying, hey, we are against slavery, so let's abandon it. And if the church wasn't speaking out against it, it suggested to the planters that, hey, then this is correct. So they continued to carry out slavery. Now, independence came in about the 1880s in Cuba and in the 1870s for Puerto Rico. So what you will find is that independence for the country actually meant independence for the slaves, which we will discover when we move into theme 7, looking at the United States in the Caribbean. Now, eventually, in 1886, that is when slavery was actually abolished in Cuba. So in 1886, the Spanish Anti-Slavery Society was formed in all of 1865. And we realized that the British one for the abolition of slavery was formed in 1823. Right? Look at the French being formed in the 1830s. And we look at the Spanish now all the way in 1865. Because, of course, of the growing resistance of the slaves, right? Because the slaves themselves wanted to get their liberation. Because look at it. In 1838, in 1848, British and French emancipation, abolition of slavery. In the Spanish Caribbean, information must have gotten to the slaves that, hey, in other territories, there is no slavery. So why are you still under bondage? So that also influenced them. Spain's feeling of isolation following the removal of the United States support after 1865 and her concern about the image. So her concern about her image, because the French give emancipation, the British give emancipation. What about us? Are we the barbarians while we are still having slaves and the other major European nations, other European powers have granted emancipation? So in the public eye, Spain was concerned about their image on the global scale. So they figured that we also need to abolish slavery. Right? And of course, the internal conflict itself that the slaves would have been trying to get rid of slavery for themselves was also major. So it wasn't necessarily something which was done from without, but it was something that was done from within. The slaves wanting their freedom, wanting their liberation, and also the local born Spanish individuals also wanting their independence from the mother country, similar to what was happening in Saint Dominic during that Haitian Revolution, right? So it wasn't necessarily only about getting rid of slavery, but rather getting emancipation or getting independence from Spain that led to the end of slavery in the Spanish territories. Right? When we come to theme 7, we will establish that the United States would have played a significant role in the abolition of slavery and also in the independence movement in Puerto Rico and also in Cuba. All right.